There's a phrase that has shut down more debates in the last few years than any actual argument. Trust the science. 3 words, and somehow that's supposed to end the conversation. No follow-up, no questions, just trust it. Today's guest spent his entire life arguing that that phrase, however well-intentioned, might be the most unscientific thing you can say. He was one of the 20th century's greatest philosophers of science, a man who escaped Nazi-occupied Vienna, taught at the London School of Economics, and gave us one of the most powerful ideas in intellectual history, that science doesn't prove things, it survives attempts to destroy them. Karl Popper, welcome to Coffee with Giants.
Thank you, Joshua. I must say, coffee is one tradition I endorse without needing to falsify it first.
I'll take it. Let's get right into it. You spent your life defending science, separating it from dogma, from ideology, and yet your work reads almost like a warning about science. How do you hold those two things together?
There is no tension once you understand what science actually is. Science is not a collection of truths. It is a method of error elimination. Every good scientific theory is really an invitation. Come, try to prove me wrong. If you cannot, I survive another day. If you can, I must be revised or abandoned. That is not a weakness. That is the entire point.
So when someone says trust the science, what are they actually saying in your view?
Usually one of two things. Either, this finding has survived rigorous testing and you should take it seriously, which is fair. Or, stop asking questions. And the second one is not science. That is dogma wearing a lab coat.
But let's be honest, that dogma sometimes has sponsors. It's not always just naivety, is it?
No. And this is a point we need to face without euphemism. Science is practiced by human beings, inside institutions, funded by someone. And whoever funds it has interests. That doesn't automatically corrupt everything, but it creates pressures that an honest scientific system needs to acknowledge and resist.
Give me a concrete example.
The tobacco industry. For decades, there was growing evidence linking cigarettes to cancer. What did the companies do? They didn't deny it outright. That would have been easy to refute. They did something far more sophisticated. They funded research designed to generate doubt. They didn't need to prove cigarettes were safe. They only needed to keep the question open. Seminars, papers, credentialed scientists being paid to manufacture uncertainty. Falsifiability was weaponized, not to find the truth, but to delay it. It cost decades and millions of lives, and the model was copied. Conflicts of interest in pharmaceutical research work the same way. A study funded by a drugs manufacturer is 4 times more likely to produce favorable results than an independent study. 4 times. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is in the literature. It is a systemic bias that science needs to name and correct, not conceal out of fear of undermining public trust.
And when science fails to self-correct, when the system doesn't work the way it should, what happens?
You get eugenics, you get lobotomy, and you get what we saw during the pandemic.
Talk about that, because a lot of people listening live through that period very closely.
Consider what was asked of people during the pandemic in the name of science. They closed outdoor markets while indoor supermarkets stayed open. They shut down parks and recreational areas in the name of protecting health, while preventing the very activity that most directly supports immune function, mental health, and physical resilience. The science on this was not ambiguous. Exercise outdoors, away from others, posed a negligible transmission risk. and yet people were fined for it, even arrested. They were told to stay home, and home became, for many, a place of sedentary anxiety. They shut down small businesses, a family restaurant, a barbershop, a music school, while large corporations continued operating. And when people asked why, when they pointed to the evidence that outdoor transmission was negligible, that the virus spread primarily in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces, they were not met with data. They were met with condescension. They were called denialists. They were told to trust the science, the very science that even at the time did not support many of those measures.
And these weren't just inconveniences. People lost their livelihoods.
Entirely. A lockdown is not an abstraction. It is a person who cannot feed their family. It is a business built over 20 years that does not survive 6 months. It is a child who loses a year of development. These are enormous costs, and they demand an enormous standard of evidence before being imposed. That standard was frequently not met. Restrictions were applied uniformly, without nuance, without transparent reasoning, and without any serious public accounting of the trade-offs. And when scientists or economists raised these trade-offs, when they questioned whether the measures were proportionate, the institutional response was suppression, not dialogue.
So the problem wasn't just that some measures were wrong. It was that questioning them was treated as dangerous.
That is precisely the problem. A measure that cannot be questioned is not a scientific measure. It is a decree. And when you dress a decree in the language of science, when you use the authority of science to silence dissent rather than to invite it, you do two things simultaneously. You make bad policy harder to correct, and you ensure that when the errors eventually surface, the damage to public trust is catastrophic.
And that's where we arrive at the heart of the problem. Because when people realize this, when they see that the science is sometimes politics, sometimes money, sometimes the suppression of dissent, the natural reaction is, I don't trust any of it. And you see that today. Vaccine denial, flat earth, rejection of basic evidence. Do you understand where that comes from?
Completely. And it would be dishonest not to acknowledge it. When an institution claims absolute authority and is then caught being biased, or corrupt, or politically motivated, people don't conclude, this specific institution failed. They conclude, all institutions lie. It is an overgeneralization, but it is psychologically understandable. Extreme distrust is, in large part, a creation of excessive authority. You plant the dogma, and you harvest the denialism.
So institutions bear direct responsibility for that phenomenon.
Direct responsibility. Whoever says don't question is cultivating, in the long run, people who believe nothing. They are two sides of the same coin, both abdications of critical thinking.
But let's ask the hard question. For the average person who isn't a scientist, who doesn't have time to read primary studies, who just lives their life, isn't it better to simply trust?
The problem is not trust. The problem is unconditional trust.
What's the difference?
Unconditional trust says, I accept this because you said so. Rational trust says, I accept this because you demonstrated it, because independent others verified it, because you acknowledge what you don't know, and because, if you are wrong, there is a mechanism for correction. One is submission, the other is informed judgment. And here is the crucial point. Rational trust is more robust. It survives when errors emerge because it was built on method, not on authority.
And extreme skepticism, the I don't trust anything position, is that more scientific?
No, it is the opposite. The extreme skeptic who rejects all evidence because there might be an agenda has made his position just as irrefutable as the dogmatist who accepts everything. No evidence could ever persuade him of anything, which means he has left the domain of critical thinking and entered a closed system. Denialism and scientific fundamentalism are mirrors of each other.
That's going to make people on both sides uncomfortable.
Good. Intellectual discomfort is a healthy sign.
Last question. If you could change one thing, not in people, but in scientific institutions, what would it be?
The culture around dissent. Today, a young scientist who questions the consensus in their field risks their career. Funding, publication, reputation. Everything depends on not disturbing the field too much. That is devastating. Because scientific progress does not come from confirming what we already know. It comes from someone having the courage to ask, what if we're wrong? If we punish that question, we are essentially preventing science from functioning.
Karl Popper, this has been extraordinary. Thank you.
The pleasure was mine. And Joshua, keep asking the questions that make people uncomfortable. They are the only ones worth asking.
Here's what I took from this conversation. Trust isn't something institutions can demand. It's something they have to earn. And the only way to earn it is to allow every uncomfortable question, every inconvenient hypothesis, every voice that says, wait, what if we're wrong? The moment you silence that voice, you don't have science anymore. You have authority. And authority without accountability is exactly what we should never trust blindly. I'll see you at the next coffee.